Hey everyone, welcome to season 6 of the Hashtag Mom Life podcast and episode 115. I'm your host, Cynthia Blaze, and this season we are framing our conversations around hard questions our kids ask. From preschool through high school, our kids ask big questions, and my goal for this series is to continue to equip myself and you ladies with biblical answers to some of these hard questions. On today's episode, I'm super excited, giddy actually, to share my conversation with Sean McDowell, who co-authored the book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, with his dad, Josh McDowell. A lot of our kids ask the question, Mom, how do I know the Bible is true? How do I know that Jesus is real? These are the questions I posed to Sean. Let's hear his answers. On today's episode, I'm super excited to introduce Sean McDowell. Sean is passionate about equipping the church and young people in particular to make the case for Christ. He has authored and co-authored 20 books, including one I reference regularly as I teach, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. He speaks regularly at camps and churches and schools, universities, conferences. He co-hosts the podcast Think Biblically. So I invited Sean here to answer two questions. How do I know the Bible is true? And how do I know that Jesus is real or was real? So books and books have been written on these topics, but I want to equip us moms to give concise, clear answers that encourage our kids to dive deeper into these topics without fear. So I told my 13-year-old son the other day, hey, you don't have to be afraid of these big questions, because as you dive into them, you'll only be satisfied by the answers. So let's meet Sean. So hi, Sean.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
I'm really excited to have you on. Thank you. Okay, so Sean, you were the speaker some years ago at family camp at Forest Home when my husband and I were there. We totally loved hearing you that week. One of my favorite sessions was, do you remember when you became an atheist for the morning and you put your glasses on and you started asking all of these like really hard questions and people were like almost brawling, like they were like up in arms. When I told my husband I was interviewing you, he was like, oh yeah, atheist guy. So
Yep.
It was great, but it really left an impression on both of us, how you argued so thoughtfully against Christianity that it really made people think about why do they believe and what do they believe.
Well, I remember that at Forest Home, believe it or not, even though I've done this dozens of times, probably around the world. I remember that exercise because I don't do it a ton at family camps. The last thing I want is somebody coming to family camp and being like discouraged in their faith. But since my dad and I were teaching that week on apologetics and worldview, I thought this is going to be an interesting way to motivate people to care. So if I tell people you got to be ready with an answer, they'll say, yes, makes sense. But if you make them uncomfortable, if you push back, if you give more thoughtful answers than they expect, then they're not only motivated for the week, but then tend to kind of feel like, wow, now I know what my students feel like. Now I see how vital this is. So really, it's a way of motivating people. And I get called that atheist guy not infrequently, or the fake atheist guy.
That's awesome. So as I was driving my kids to school today, I told them I was going to interview you. And I said I was going to ask you two questions. So they were like, of course, which ones, Mom? So I told them, how do I know the Bible is true? And how do I know that Jesus was real? And they're like, Mom, those are the nerd questions. They're like, only nerd kids ask those questions. And I was like, well, I ask those questions. And they're like, because you're a nerd, Mom. So I was dying. So yes, the first question that we're going to dive into of the nerd questions, apparently, according to my kids, let's start with the Bible. Okay, so there's like so many other moms in our community, you know, we reference the Bible. It's the foundation of our lives. We talk about it. We use it as the basis for the behavior we are asking our kids to follow. So naturally, they will ask, well, how do I know this Bible is true? So how do we as moms begin to answer that question?
First off, I take it as a compliment if one of my kids tells me that I'm a nerd. And they tell me that all the time. And you can see behind me, I've got Thanos's hand and, Thor's hammer and a
Okay.
basketball. So that's a compliment. But at its core, these are the big questions. I really think questions of, is the Bible true? And is it authoritative? Is one of, if not the most important question for Christians to wrestle with. So is it my feelings? Is it culture? Is it some other authority, or is it scripture? So why scripture? Well, first off, it's really interesting. The Bible is probably written by about 36 writers from different professions, roughly over 1,500 years. What makes it unique is that although you have poetry and you have history and you have apocalyptic literature, there really is a common thread from Genesis through Revelation. The theme of the Old Testament is the anticipation of Jesus. The New Testament is the coming and realization of Jesus. Now, when Jesus comes, we can look back and understand the Old Testament through a new light. So, one way of if we started with the Old Testament, how do we know the Old Testament is true? Well, if we really have the words of Jesus in the Gospels copied and written down reliably, and we will come to that. And Jesus consistently points to the Old Testament as being authoritative and being true, then that's a pretty darn good starting place for taking the Old Testament seriously. And we see this with Jesus, like in Matthew 19, when he's asked about divorce. He points towards Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and he says, have you not heard? In other words, it's written, and what was written at the beginning in that book is still authoritative for how we should think about marriage. That's just one example. Consistently, Jesus cites the Old Testament when he's being tempted all throughout his ministry. He saw himself as fulfilling the Old Testament and the Old Testament having an authority within itself. That's a starting place. And the other place we can go with the Old Testament is we can just look at archaeology. Is there historical record that confirms and supports the claims of the Old Testament? Now, most things are destroyed and they're lost and names are changed. So, of course, there's a lot of findings that we just haven't discovered yet. But what's amazing is how many we have found that do match up. We're talking going way back to the time of Abraham and the patriarchs, the gate of Abraham, going through the other patriarchs. Even there's some evidence tied to the person of Joseph when you look at how much he was sold for the silver, and it matches up with the record of that time. There's these little findings that we have that piece together and tell us the story got it right. Now, with that said, I don't want to overstate that, because there are certain things that we're still uncovering the evidence and we're still debating and still figuring out. We're dealing with these things, 2, 3, 4,000 years old, possibly in some cases. But you just pick up a copy of the Archaeological Study Bible and you can see myriads and myriads of coins and pottery and sites and inscriptions that have been uncovered that help tell us this isn't just fictional in some land far away, but these are real people and events and places and times. The other thing we could look at with the Old Testament is just how careful the scribes were. And some of the evidence we have, like the Masoretic scribes, this is well into the second century. Into the second millennium, like 1000 AD, roughly, in that period. And these were carefully copied. A lot of the Bible we have today, the Old Testament, was copied by the Masoretic tradition. And this is where they were very careful with every letter and with every counting and copying. Of course, that takes us back roughly to 1000 AD. And then we can go to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then we can go to some other copies. We can look at the Old Testament about how careful these scribes were. And although the Bible didn't fall out of heaven, there are some passages that we still are not sure exactly what the original said. As a whole, the textual tradition, the archaeological tradition tells us that this is a book we can trust as being reliable. So I guess in sum, if I was going to give someone quick answers, I'd say, look at how Jesus views the Old Testament. Let's look at archaeology. And let's look at how careful these scribes were, unprecedented compared to any other religious tradition, tells us they believed they had the word of God and copied it carefully.
Can you talk just a little bit about how we got the Bible?
Sure. Yeah. So the New Testament is a little bit easier to understand than some of the Old Testament because the New Testament is a lot more recent and we have a lot more manuscripts of this. But if we're talking about the Old Testament, it's actually during the time of Moses, of course, and people debate whether this is the 13th or the 15th century. There's somewhat of an open debate about this. But the point being, Moses is where we first have the Bible written down in the Ten Commandments, front and back, two of the plaques, so to speak. And it's written by the finger of God. So this is the first part we have a text that's written down, but that also tells us that there's something authoritative. The source comes from God. And that's why in Joshua, he's like, we will follow the word of the law and it's authoritative. It will not depart from our mouth. So Moses, the traditional author of the first 5 books of the Bible, and then probably Joshua, you move on to Samuel. As you work through the Old Testament, there was roughly this tradition that would take the books that existed before, pass them on, they would be collected, and then, of course, added over time through the people of God and the prophets. Now, that's the quick version, but we hear some stories like in Kings where the scrolls were lost and then they are uncovered, and people go, oh my goodness, we've lost the identity of who we are. And then they repent and turn back to the Lord. But you might say the Old Testament from the time of Moses up until, 300-400 years before the time of Christ, there's this progressive adding of scripture written by prophets, copied carefully, and kept together over time.
Yeah, and as I've been teaching at our church, I taught the Pentateuch last year to our women, and it is interesting to notice where it will say in small places like, and Moses wrote it down and it was added to the book of the law. And
Yeah.
so those are things I hadn't actually really noticed before until the study. And even as you mentioned Joshua, where he says, meditate on this day and night, that assumes that he actually had something written at that point to meditate on day and night. That was really encouraging to me to realize that even from the very beginning, this was being written down and was being copied and was being transmitted.
That's right. And was authoritative from the beginning. That's a really important piece too. But you're right. From the very beginning, there's this sense that God has given us a message. Let's write this down, preserve it in our generation, transmit it to the next. That's built in from the beginning, a value of the Jewish people. And that's, of course, one reason why the Christians are also people of the book and very quickly start writing this down because of the tradition that they come from.
Yeah. Okay, so then let's move on to the New Testament for a minute. So can you share a few key pieces about how we know that the New Testament is historically reliable?
Okay, so the Old Testament, 39 books. The New Testament, 27. Now, the Old Testament was probably written, I don't know, over a span of like, say, a millennium. The New Testament, within a century, even less. Of course, there's debate about when we would date those anyways, but some would say maybe even within half a century. So it's a much smaller time period. And so we're going to have a lot more manuscripts. There's a lot less historical gap to the Old Testament. So really, when we look at the New Testament, we're going to look at a few things. One is there internal evidence that they claim to be writing actual history? Now, this doesn't mean it's true, but it's a place to start with. So, for example, Luke begins his gospel. He says, many have undertaken, to give an account of the things that have happened before us. But I have carefully investigated everything to you to assure you of the certainty of what is written. That's Luke 1:1-4. Luke is a medical doctor. So he's obviously educated, and he's telling us that there's other accounts, but he's very carefully investigated things. You see that in like 2 Peter, when Peter says we aren't following myths or stories that were there, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. You see in 1 John, when 1 John writes his letter, he says, what we have seen, what we have heard, what we have touched with our hands, this we proclaim to you. So seen, heard, and touched. if you read the New Testament in the same way, it's amazing how over and over again the writers say, we were there, we saw this, we are witnesses. And they're writing in a way that's not fiction. Now, some people might say, well, even fictional stories say this, but that's more modern fiction than it was ancient fiction. Luke's prologue is a way of saying, I'm trying to write careful history. And so, all the way through the Gospels, through some of the different letters, I mean, there are dozens and dozens of statements that these writers claim to be writing what is true. The other thing you find is you also find really embarrassing material that's included. Now, why this matters is when people invent material, either on social media or in life, it's either to make ourselves look good or get out of trouble. We just read the Gospels and even Galatians, and there's all this embarrassing material like Peter denying Jesus, Jesus calling Peter Satan, disciples not understanding the teachings of Jesus, the disciples falling asleep in Gethsemane. What does that tell us? It tells us, in one way, it's a hint that the writers care about truth and will report things, even if they're disparaging to their character. The other thing is, I think the apostles are willing to suffer and die for the belief that they had seen risen Jesus, at least minimally shows sincerity. So if you just look inside the writings, they claim to be writing what is true. They give embarrassing facts. They even give, like in Luke chapter 3, Luke gives an incredible amount of details in just the first 2 verses in Luke chapter 3, where he talks about Herod and he talks about the Caesar at this time and the place and the time. I mean, this is not fictional in a land far, far away. The writers are situating this in a certain place, in a certain time. So just when you look inside the Gospels, I would argue that it has the ring of truth of people at least trying to portray what they think is true. That's step number 1. Step number 2 is we have to look at kind of the copying techniques in the New Testament. This is where it's a little different than the Old Testament. And there's different ways of going about this, but we have to look at how many copies do we have? How early are they? How reliable are these copies? Different languages. And you just start to piece together textually, can we trust this textual tradition? And the bottom line is, and when we talk about manuscripts, these are pieces written oftentimes on codice, like books, or on scrolls. And the question is, when were these written? How reliable are these? And you can start to compare and contrast them and have a high degree of confidence that we have in our hands what is very, very close to what was first written down. That's kind of textual criticism, so to speak. So number 1 is what we refer to as kind of the internal test. Second is what you might call the copy test. Actually, the first one to use the C, I call it the character test. So they have the character to be reliable. The middle, the copy test. And then third, corroboration. Is there evidence outside of this book that supports the claims that are inside? And that's where we look at writers like Tacitus and Josephus, who fill in certain details that help support, and into the 2nd century, Pliny the Younger, so to speak. And then also where you look at archaeology. One of the most popular videos I've done on my YouTube channel was 10 archaeological discoveries for Jesus. And I walked through with Titus Kennedy, who's an adjunct professor with me at Biola, just where Jesus was born, where he was crucified, where he ministered, all these different places. And that's a kind of external corroboration. So I guess in sum, we have reason to believe the apostles have character. We have reason to believe that this book is copied carefully and faithfully. And then third, there's corroboration outside of it that gives us internal support within.
Awesome. So just to kind of like make sure I'm understanding. So when someone says like, okay, well, how do I know that what I'm reading in my Bible is the same thing that was written, thousands of years before? How would you sum that up? I know you've said it, but just sort of to sum that up.
I would say we're probably tempted to think of this like the telephone game, that it gets changed from one person to the next. The problem with the telephone game is you whisper, and there's one line of transmission from one person to the next, and it's kind of funny if you mess it up. This is not how the Bible was copied and transmitted. Number one, they had this Jewish sense of reverence for the scriptures and the word of God. Number two, we have very careful scribes that would write this down and wanted to make sure it was passed on. Number three, it wasn't just one line. We have different lines and traditions of copying that we can compare and contrast together. So when you just look at the New Testament compared to other ancient books, the New Testament is in a category of its own compared to other ancient books that many scholars won't even question as being reliable.
Yeah, can you give us that number? Because I know there's a huge, like, if you weigh how many copies we have of the New Testament versus like a Greek author, like a Homer or something like that, it's huge, right?
Yeah. So Dan Wallace, who's really a brilliant textual critic, works at Dallas Theological Seminary. He would say the average classical writing, if you kind of stacked the manuscripts, would be about 4 feet high. For the New Testament, it's over a mile high, the number that we have.
So that's
So
the
4
amount of
feet,
copies we have of those writings.
exactly. The amount of, so 4 feet to a mile high. Now, what that means is there's going to be more variances and differences in the New Testament because we have so many different versions. But we can compare and we contrast and we can look. This is what textual critics do. So you might just say we have an abundance of manuscripts to help people methodically and carefully have a high degree of confidence that it's been copied down carefully. And the other piece I would add to this is Jesus also taught in stories. I'm a communication major, and I know that people remember stories better than anything else. If you have a conversation with somebody and you think the next day later, you might remember a story the person told. So Jesus told in stories and communicated in a way that could so easily be remembered and passed on and written down. We also remember things when emotions are involved. And clearly in the ministry of Jesus, there are some highs and some lows, the kind of things that get implanted into your brain. So Jesus was a masterful communicator that spoke in a way that could be remembered and written down even a few years later.
You mentioned variants, and one thing I had read. Now, a variant, you can correct me if I'm wrong. A variant is that of all these thousands of manuscripts we have, there might be some minor differences in them. One thing that I've read is that those differences are minor primarily. There's like a
Mhm.
copy change, a word was doubled, or maybe words that sound similar were replaced with each other. But there's no time in all those variants that any theological question is ever an issue. Like there's no time in all those variants where anything says, oh yeah, Jesus was just a great teacher, that it's only like very small things like almost punctuation in the sense that's different versus any theological truths that would vary between those manuscripts. Is that correct?
So Peter Gurry is a friend of mine, written some great books on this, just a wonderful New Testament textual critic, estimates that there's about 500,000 non-spelling differences in the 5,000 Greek manuscripts that we have.
Wow.
That's his best estimate. So it feels like a lot, but when you start to break it down and say, what kind of differences are these? Very few are substantive at all. So, for example, the Gospel of Mark is about Jesus being the Son of God. Well, there's a variance in Mark 1:1, whether it talks about Jesus Christ and then the reference says Son of God, and then it continues. Was that added later by people to clarify the theme up front, or was that in the original? We're not sure. Well, nothing is at stake in understanding Mark from whether Son of God goes there, because that's the theme in Mark 15, when even the Roman centurion says, surely he was the Son of God. That's an example of a variant. So there's only two passages that are more than two verses for which there is debate about whether they're in the original. And that's the last few verses. I think it's 12 verses at the end of Mark and John 7:53 through 8:11, which is the woman caught in adultery.
Yeah.
Most scholars say those probably weren't in the original. I haven't done the deep dive, so I trust them on that. But any good Bible will have a footnote and say there's textual debate about this. We don't know. Now, that's interesting, and that's something we should know. But what happens is some people have never heard this. They've been taught the Bible fell down from heaven. They realize that beloved story in John may not be in the original, and it unsettles them. That's why we have to be honest and say, gosh, the New Testament has been copied faithfully. We can have high degree of confidence. But there's a few passages, there's a few words. For example, 1 John 5:7 has a clear reference to the Trinity. And a lot of scholars argue that was added later to have one verse that captures the Trinity. Well, the doctrine of the Trinity is not at stake. That's taught in the Bible. I'm just not sure it's taught in one clear verse in 1 John 5:7. So when we take the Bible as a whole, there is no central doctrine at stake, but there are a few passages here and there for which there is some debate. Even the mark of the beast, is it 666 or 616? There's a little debate about that. Interesting, interesting, but you're right that it's not a central theological issue tied to the faith.
So, like when we explore variants, it's nothing to be afraid of because it's not going to suddenly challenge our faith. It's just potentially copied. It's these manuscripts are copied by real people who made mistakes and they are fallible. But I appreciate your reminder that we have such a huge amount of these original manuscripts that it's that we weigh that. I know that scholars weigh them against each other and have come up with truly what they believe are the original, or as close to the original as we can have at this point.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So, some scholars will tell me this, say, we know the original is out there in some manuscripts that we have. We are just figuring out exactly where it is.
Yeah.
And so ironically, the further we move away from the events, you'd think the less confidence we have. But it's actually the opposite. The more things like even artificial intelligence and other technologies and further manuscripts are giving us greater confidence as we move forward, not less.
Because they analyze the text through new technology.
Sure.
Yeah.
And
cool.
I mean, one of the recent Dead Sea Scroll finds, if I'm not mistaken, they were using like drones to discover this thing and like crazy technology.
That's
It's
awesome.
just fascinating. So we don't have anything to be afraid of. Now, if our standard is just certainty and no questions and the Bible fell out of heaven, yeah, well, then you should be afraid. But that's not what our standard should be. I don't think that's how we should look at it. If we have an honest look at it and follow the evidence, the more I do this, the greater confidence I have in the scriptures.
That's awesome. All right, let's talk about evidence for Jesus. That's the next big question. So, my son told me actually that one of his classmates actually asked him, like, who's a classmate who's Jewish, said, "How do we know that Jesus was real?" And I think sometimes people liken him to like fairy tales, or but I know that there is huge historical evidence that he was a real person. So when our kids ask us that question, how do I know that Jesus was real? How do we moms approach that?
So here's what I would say. I would respond by saying, do you have any doubt that Jesus is real? And I'm only saying that because when my kids ask me questions, I want to kind of know where this question is coming from and just start a conversation with them. So oftentimes I'll say, did you hear that? Were you watching a YouTube video? Are you just wondering? I'm curious, where did this question come from? And it might be something very different than just giving my kid a lecture. I also want to teach my kid how to think. So how do we know that anybody really is a historical figure? How do we know someone from 2,000 years ago is real? Julius Caesar. What about a historical figure like Abraham Lincoln? How do we know anyone from the past? Like, without not answering my kids' questions, I want to invite him into a conversation, get to the heart of the question, and teach him how to think. That's what my dad often did with me. So that's just methodologically how I'll approach this. But if a kid said, well, yeah, I'm just wondering, what's the evidence that Jesus was real? I'd say, well, keep in mind, there are virtually no scholars from the left to the right who doubt that Jesus existed. There's far more who doubt evolution, and we're told that's an extreme minority than who doubt the historical Jesus. Even Bart Ehrman, who's one of the leading agnostics slash atheists of our day, wrote a whole book arguing that Jesus existed and that the idea that Jesus didn't exist is a myth that appeared, I think he said, in like the 18th century, the myth of the mythical Jesus. And the reason is because we have the four gospels. Even if you don't think they're inspired, they are historical documents. We have the letters of Paul. We have the rest of the New Testament. We have other early church fathers who come after the writing of the Gospels themselves, the end of the first century into the second century. And then you have Jewish writers like Josephus, Roman writers like Tacitus. For a figure like Jesus, who had a public ministry probably 3 years in an obscure part of the kingdom, we have an abundance more than sufficient to establish that Jesus was a historical person. If you doubt the existence of Jesus, you are on the far out fringe of scholarship.
So I know, as you mentioned, there are some historical references to Jesus. Without going into too much detail, could you mention just sort of what other sources mention him and why that's significant?
Yeah, I could. Now, one thing I do say when somebody asks for evidence outside the Bible, and you didn't frame it this way, I'll often say, you know what? Even if we had zero evidence outside of the Gospels, I still think we have sufficient evidence because of the reliability of the Gospels and the New Testament themselves. So sometimes behind that question is people not saying this in words, but implying, do you have any real historical sources? Do you have any unbiased historical sources? And of course, the Gospels are real. They have a bias, but so does every other document. So, with that said, one of the big references would be Josephus, who writes in the 90s, a Jewish writer writing on behalf of Rome. And there's two references that he makes to Jesus. And one is a little bit contested. I won't go into the contest and the debate, but there's a very good chance he just referred to Jesus, who is considered the Messiah, crucified at that time. And then there's a reference where James, the death of James, he's referred to as the brother of Jesus. Now, you are typically referred to as the son of somebody, unless your brother is more prominent than your son. And if your brother is Jesus, it would make sense you'd be referred to that. And it's this incidental side comment, which, since nobody doubted the existence of Jesus, is just totally not the kind of thing that would be invented. So Josephus is one source in the 90s. You get into the second century, and you've got Tacitus, a Roman historian who wrote some of the most important writings from that time. And he references the death of Jesus and his crucifixion and some of the persecution of Christians. And that document is written in a certain way where it's really disparaging to Christians. And it calls them like this superstition that spread, which is just not the kind of thing I think Christians would invent to characterize themselves in that fashion. Those are two early sources. There's many others you could talk about, like Pliny the Younger you could go into. You can go into other certain Greek sources. But there's a sufficient amount. And of course, the other church fathers, people like Clement of Rome and Ignatius, you have a range of voices affirming the basic storyline of Jesus from the time of the Gospels moving forward.
And also, people ask about the resurrection. So, what evidence do we have for the resurrection? Okay, Jesus was a historical dude, but how do we know he was actually resurrected? So, what's your response to that?
Yeah, so this is a huge question, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
I teach an entire semester course at Biola in a grad program on the resurrection. And we have a lot of moms who join us, by the way. Full semester on that. And so if somebody's skeptical and asking me, I'll say, there's a few facts that historians agree on. And it seems to me that the resurrection is the best explanation. Here's some of those facts, and then maybe tell me what you think. Number one, we know Jesus died by crucifixion. We know this because it's reported in the Gospels. It's reported by Josephus. It's reported by Tacitus. And frankly, if they're inventing a Messiah, it made no sense to invent one crucified and publicly shamed. That's the opposite of what would be invented. So we know Jesus died by crucifixion. What's interesting is we also have good reason to believe Jesus was buried. We know the name of the person in all four gospels, where he's from, Arimathea, his position in the Sanhedrin, where Jesus was actually buried. And there's no other contestable claims that I'm aware of early at all that claim Jesus was buried anywhere else. And Jerusalem is not that big. If they're going to say the person and his position, people could kind of know and confirm this to a degree. So Jesus died, he's buried. Third is the tomb is found empty. And Gary Habermas has chronicled about 21 arguments for this, but I'll give you two that I think are interesting. One is that it's discovered by women. Now, why is that significant? Because in that culture, a man's testimony was considered much more significant. One time I made the mistake and I said a man's testimony was more considered and somebody's was more valuable. And they said, I think you mean considered. I said, yes, I stand corrected. It was considered more in that patriarchal culture. So if they're inventing a story, why invent that women discovered the empty tomb? It doesn't make sense. That's one reason.
Right, because they weren't
Second,
considered reliable witnesses, correct?
yeah, they could testify at times, but not near as reliable or valuable, you might say, as a man's testimony. There's even a Jewish proverb that says, better the words of the law burnt than delivered to women. These are certain ideas embedded at that time. So the fact that women discover it, all four gospels, tells us they're not likely making that up. Another reason for the empty tomb would be, it's very interesting. The first response from the religious leaders was the disciples stole the body. Well, that's a concession that the body is gone.
Mm.
You don't say, my dog ate my homework if you have your homework. You say it if your homework is gone. That's a concession. Of course, it's only recorded in Matthew. I get that the tomb is empty. So these are the kinds of arguments you put forward. And by the way, the apostles also go back and start preaching in Acts 2, Pentecost, in the very city in which Jesus was crucified and buried. Minimally shows a lot of confidence that no one's going to be able to find the body and that tomb was really empty. So Jesus dies, Jesus was buried, the tomb was empty. And then third, you have all these appearance accounts to the 12, to the 500. You have appearance accounts in the gospel. You have appearance accounts in Paul, who also reports this. And so what's the best explanation of this? I think the only explanation that accounts for all of these is that Jesus was resurrected. So if somebody asks me that question, is willing to listen, I will just simply say, sometimes I'll just say, here's three facts. Jesus died by crucifixion, tomb was empty, appears to people. If you don't think he really resurrected, what story do you think best accounts for the emergence of the Christian faith? And this is where some will say, well, maybe hallucinations. Well, hallucinations could in principle account for the appearances, but then the body would still be in the tomb. So it can't account for the empty tomb. Some would say, well, he didn't really die on the cross, the swoon theory. Well, you can make that argument, but the problem is the evidence that he died on the cross is really, really compelling.
And even if he did swoon, like I've read, the way he was so beaten up that he wouldn't just appear as this healthy person afterwards, that, right, he would be near death and he would still be looking like he was near death, versus healed and energized and excited as he is.
Yeah, that response was made by a skeptic, David Strauss, years ago. He embraced a different theory, but it was like the idea Jesus didn't die is crazy because the brutal torture he went through. You give other hypotheses, but they're not going to account for all the facts. There's only one that accounts for all the facts that we know, that Jesus really rose from the grave.
I think I just want to go back and mention, because you said it, but just to highlight it, that the disciples were testifying to the resurrection of Jesus in the city where he had been crucified. And I think that's valuable, because if he was still in the grave, people would just say, oh no, it's right here. This is a tiny town, right? we know where he's buried. His grave is still here. He's still in it. But the disciples were preaching this in a town where people would have realized that his tomb was empty, and they were trying to understand why it would be empty as well.
Mm.
So I
Yeah.
you can add more if you want to.
Well, I think that's such a good point. And if you look closely in the speeches in Acts, Peter says, this Jesus you crucified, he's risen from the grave, appeared to us. And these things are true. In other words, Peter publicly not only says this, but he appeals to the knowledge of those, saying, and this happened in public, and you all know this is true. Minimally, that shows a lot of confidence by Peter.
And I think one other thing that I read that I think is significant too, and I'd love to have you comment on it too, is that evidence for the resurrection is simply the changed lives of his disciples, of his followers afterwards. Could you comment on that for a minute?
I think that's one piece of evidence, is the transformation of the disciples. So even though Jesus had predicted his death, you see it in Mark 8, Mark 9, and Mark 10, they don't really understand it. They have this faulty view of kind of this reigning Messiah that's going to come. So when Jesus is crucified, they're confused. They leave. They flee. They don't know what's happening. They're despairing. You see the apostles in Luke 24 being like, we thought he was the one. But then all of a sudden, the claim is that they saw the risen Jesus. We see this at the end of the Gospels, at the beginning of Acts. And then what happens? And then they become bold kind of proclaimers of the faith, where early in Acts 4 and 5, they go out and they start preaching Jesus, and they're threatened and they're beaten. We see Stephen killed early. We see James, the son of Zebedee, killed in Acts 12. And all they're told is just stop proclaiming this Jesus. Well, you don't intentionally put yourself in harm's way for something you know is false. This seems to at least minimally show that they were sincere. And if they didn't see the risen Jesus, which is all the records we have, they're going to have to give us some other account for that. And I just don't find any that are compelling enough to account for not only the apostles, but also the conversion of Paul and his boldness.
Yeah, because they come across as like fearful and scared in the Gospels and not understanding. And then, Peter's denying Jesus right before his crucifixion. And then suddenly he's the one preaching in Acts to thousands of people and not caring if the Romans see him or will put him in prison. So at least personally, I think that's interesting, because maybe it's because that's what Jesus does for all of us, is that he changes our lives, is that when we encounter him truly, we are different. And I think I think that's a powerful part of the Gospels, or about that we see in Acts.
Amen to that. That's what I did my whole dissertation on, the deaths of the apostles. And they're willing to put themselves in harm's way because I think they believe Jesus had risen from the grave. By the way, the earliest accounts we have to be a Christian is to believe that Jesus lived, died, buried, and rose for our sins. That's the consistent early message. That's what they believed. That's what they proclaimed. The Christian faith was a resurrection movement from the beginning.
Awesome. Okay, I'd like to ask you a question that I didn't ask you in advance, but I was just curious.
Sure.
Is you talk about teaching your kids logic, and I think that's really interesting. How, if you can answer just off the cuff, how do you kind of go through that process? Because I think that's something that's crucial with our kids as we're raising them now, because they're taught a lot of things in their courses and classes that aren't necessarily logical.
That's a great question. So I don't formally teach my kids logic.
Yeah.
I don't have like a logic book and give them assignments to and work it through. I'm consistently and regularly engaging my kids in conversation whenever I can. In the car, if we go to breakfast, sitting at the dinner table, we just ask them questions, engaging them, making them think, pushing back, challenging them with ideas. That's something my dad did. A lot of people would assume that my dad, because he was and is an apologist, just told me, hey, believe this, son, and here's what's true. He would like push back and ask questions, and he'd lean back and he'd go, what if I said this? And he'd play the skeptic and say, how do you respond to that? What do you think? And just taught me to think which was important when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. But now with social media and with fake news,
Yeah.
it's even more important that kids know how to think. So it's more in line with, I think, what Deuteronomy 6 says: talk about these things with your kids when you lie down, when they get up, when you go to sleep, when you walk along the way, weaving this intentionally throughout life without exasperating my kids, is what I try to do.
That's good. Um, Thank you. You have answered my questions, and I really appreciate that. And it's been great. Now, if okay, let's say a mom wants to dive deeper into these topics. Um, what books or resources can you recommend? You even mentioned a YouTube channel you have. Like maybe if you could give like a mom with younger kids and a mom with older kids, like a resource or two that you would recommend.
Oh gosh, let me make some general ones. I'd have to think about a difference there.
Sure.
So free resources, you mentioned YouTube. I do interviews probably twice a week with people and sometimes just post content that I do. So just last week or a week before that, did a full one on the Old Testament, how we know the Old Testament is reliable from an Old Testament scholar. And I'm doing this for lay folks, not for scholars, but we're going to go into even a little more depth, like a whole show on that to give people confidence. Done a couple recently on the resurrection. Have done some on questions of the reality of demons and proof for heaven. And actually, we'll have on a lot of people with different worldviews to have conversations and model. So I've had a ton of moms, I get messages all the time. They're like, when I'm strolling the kids or doing stuff around the house or just driving to work, whatever it is, throw it on in the background. That's free. And there's just content there you can work through. So that's always helpful. And there's some other good YouTube channels I really enjoy. I really enjoy Alan Parr and Mike Winger and Elisa Childers doing great content on YouTube. And of course, free is good. As far as books, I think the book Evidence That Demands a Verdict you mentioned is just important for everybody to work through. Even if it's 15 minutes a day, you really own it. You can work at your own pace. Don't try to do it all in a weekend. It's too much. But that is kind of a staple book that I think every Christian really should have to be ready with an answer. Now, someone who's done great work for moms and dads is Natasha Crane. She's a friend of mine, and she's done apologetics for families, like talking
Mhm.
about Jesus, talking about the Bible, and takes this evidence and really says, here's how you talk to your kids. Here's a plan. Here's questions to ask them. Makes it as practical as it can be. So working through evidence gives somebody the confidence to have the deeper understanding. But her books are really some of the best that I've seen that can help parents, moms and dads, engage their kids practically. So, and by the way, if you're like, listen, you really want to know this stuff, we do literally have moms in our apologetics program. We just take one class at a time and start working through my class on evil, my class on the resurrection, and start working towards this stuff. So if anybody's like super motivated, we'll take you.
That's awesome. You're at Talbot, right?
Yeah. So Talbot is Biola's theological
Yeah.
school, and I teach in the master's in Christian apologetics.
That's awesome. I have to tell you that I got the Audible version of Evidence That Demands a Verdict. When I started it the first time, I think I did like a triple take. I kept, because it told me how long
Oh,
it was.
oh, it's long.
And it was like 40 hours. And I
It
literally was
is.
like,
Yep.
what? And, but one thing I actually really appreciate about it and being in the Audible version is that you guys have titled it really well in
Mm.
the Audible format. So I can go to
Oh,
it and
good.
I can look up evidence for the Old Testament scriptures, and it's an hour, and I can listen to that. And so I actually really appreciate it. I haven't worked, start to finish, but I will continually
Sure.
reference back to it. And so I really appreciate the Audible version of it.
Oh, that's super cool. Yeah, I
I
listen
listen
to a
in
lot
my
of
car
books
as
too.
I drive around, running my
Good, good.
errands.
And there's good podcasts too. I listen to books and podcasts.
Mhm.
I think you mentioned I co-host Think Biblically, that's not just apologetics. That's more worldview and cultural engagement, but we do some apologetics there as well. And there's some other wonderful podcasts. I love Greg Kokel's podcast. It's one of my favorite with Stand to Reason. I listen to it weekly, and he's really like a mentor of mine Because what he's so good at is he not only answers questions, but he walks you through how he answers the questions. So I feel like he's teaching me how to think through it. So I think there's a lot of moms. And Alicia Childers' podcast is great too. She does it on YouTube and through a podcast. Those are a couple trustworthy ones that I think folks would really enjoy.
Awesome. I totally appreciate that. Well, any last thoughts or words of encouragement for those listening before we close?
You know what? I would say to the moms, here's the encouragement. This can feel overwhelming. And I get it. It's overwhelming just to be a mom. Not that I am one, but I've seen my wife and just the weight that she carries and how tough it is. And sometimes it's like, will this ever end when you have younger kids? Don't feel like you have to have all the answers. Really, the studies show that kids don't leave their faith because of doubt. They leave because of unexpressed doubt. So just creating a climate where questions are welcome and saying, gosh, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. Let's look this up together and talk about it. Let's call our pastor. Whatever it is, let's watch this video together. That's building relationship. It's showing that you don't pretend to have all the answers. In fact, sometimes just giving a quick answer that's not true is worse than saying you don't know, because later a kid will look it up and then you'll lose credibility in their eyes. So if there were a formula to pass it on your faith, number one would be living out your faith. Number two, building relationships with your kids. And number three, having meaningful spiritual conversations. That's it. So live out your faith, build relationships with your kids, and have meaningful spiritual conversations. So for me, at the very beginning, when your kids said, they asked you what questions you're going to ask, those are nerd questions. I would have said, well, what questions do you think I should ask and why? If these are nerd questions, what's your answer for this since it's so easy? How do you know the Bible's true? Like I'm always thinking, put it back, engage, ask questions, see what they're thinking. That's my default with kids. Have that conversation more than just lecture.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. This was amazing. I really appreciate you taking this time to have this conversation with me. Thank you. I appreciate it a lot.
Such good questions. Thanks for what you're doing and thanks for having me on.
I hope you ladies now feel more confident talking to your kids about the truth of the Bible and the reality of Jesus. Don't be afraid to dive into these hard questions with your kids. The more information you gain, the more confident you'll be. I remember I had this big aha moment when I learned why the Dead Sea Scrolls were significant. I'd always heard what an amazing find they were, but I was like, why? Sean mentioned the Masoretes. They were a group of people who meticulously copied and maintained the Old Testament, or Hebrew Scriptures. The version of the Old Testament that is in our Bibles is what is called the Masoretic text. It's the version of the Old Testament that was copied and maintained by these Masoretes, and it was finalized into its current version somewhere around the 900s BC. So before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the oldest copy of the Old Testament we had was dated to 895 AD, and that was called the Cairo Codex. So previously, we knew our version of the Old Testament was essentially the same as these versions from the late 800s to early 900s AD. That's the Old Testament that had been copied and transmitted accurately since then. But we didn't know if the same version that is in our testaments is the version that Jesus had and that he authorized as true. We didn't know this until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are scrolls of books of the Old Testament with multiple copies of each. There are 33 copies of Deuteronomy, 24 of Genesis, 22 of Isaiah, actually, and so on. There are fragments of every single book of the Old Testament, actually, except for Esther. And these fragments were all hidden in a cave, or various caves, somewhere around 70 AD, meaning that they represent the version of the Hebrew Bible that Jesus would have known and read and taught from. So the big question was, would these versions of these books be the same as the versions we currently have in our Old Testament? Meaning, have they been copied correctly, really, for the last 2,000 years? Want to guess the answer? Yes. crazy. So overarchingly, the text of the Old Testament we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls is the same we've been reading in our Bibles. So had the Old Testament been transmitted accurately? And yes, isn't that fantastic? So ladies, don't be afraid to dive deep into the question of, is the Bible true and was Jesus real? Because you will only be satisfied with the answers you uncover. And ladies, if you find these podcast conversations encouraging and helpful, please subscribe, share them with a friend, and give us a positive review on iTunes or now YouTube. You can find out more about today's episode, show notes from our discussion, and listen to past conversations at momlife.ljpress.org. Hashtag MomLife is a ministry of La Jolla Presbyterian Church. Today's episode was produced by myself, Jim Cedric, and Justin Kent, and I'm your host, Cynthia Blaze. I pray that each of you ladies experience Christ's deep love for you today, surrender to his leading, and find ways to love, bless, and encourage someone else along your journey today.